This is the respiratory system, Unit 3. What is the function of the respiratory system? What is the structural organization of the respiratory system and its major organs? How do other systems relate to the respiratory system, such as the neurological and musculoskeletal systems? The respiratory system includes the nose, the nasal cavity, the larynx, the trachea, and smaller conducting passageways leading to the gas exchange surfaces of the lungs. The respiratory tract includes airways that carry air to and from such cellular surfaces and can be divided into a conducting portion and a respiratory portion. The conducting portion extends from the nasal cavity to the bronchioles of the lungs. The respiratory portion includes the respiratory bronchioles and the alveoli where gas exchange occurs. The upper respiratory system includes the nose, nasal cavities, sinuses, and pharynx. These passageways filter, warm, and humidify the air, protecting the more delicate conduction and exchange surfaces of the lower respiratory system from debris, pathogens, and environmental extremes. The lower respiratory system includes the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. There are 6 functions of the respiratory system. 1. To provide area for gas exchange between air and circulation. 2. Move air in and out of lungs. 3. Protect respiratory surfaces from dehydration or environmental variations. 4. Defend the respiratory system and other tissues from invasion by pathogenic microorganisms. 5. Produce sounds involved in speaking, singing, or nonverbal communication. And 6. Assist in the regulation of blood volume, blood pressure, and the control of body fluid pH. The respiratory epithelium consists of cytostratified, ciliated, columnar, and numerous mucus cells. The respiratory epithelium lines the entire respiratory tract, except for the inferior portions of the pharynx, the smallest conducting passageways, and the alveoli. Stratified squamous epithelium lines the inferior portion of the pharynx, protecting it from abrasion and chemical harm. Mucus cells in the epithelium and mucus glands deep to the respiratory epithelium in the lamina produce sticky mucus that bathes the exposed surfaces. In lower portions of the respiratory tract, the cilia also beat towards the pharynx, creating a mucus escalator that cleanses the respiratory passageway. The respiratory filtration mechanisms form the respiratory defense system: filtration, warming, and humidification. In the nasal cavity, for example, all particles larger than 10 nanometers are removed from the inspired air. The nose is the primary pathway for air entering into the respiratory system. Air normally enters the respiratory system through the paired external nares, which open into the nasal cavity. The nasal vestibule is the portion of the nasal cavity enclosed by the flexible tissues of the nose. The nasal septum separates the right and left portion of the nasal cavity. The bridge of the nose is known as the dorsum, and the tip of the nose is the apex. Bones associated with nose structure include the sphenoid, ethmoid, vomer, maxillae, nasal, and frontal bones. A bony hard palate formed by the maxillary and palatine bones forms the floor of the nasal cavity and separates the oral and nasal cavities. A fleshy, soft palate extends posterior to the hard palate, marking the boundary line between the superior nasopharynx and the rest of the pharynx. The nasal cavity opens into the nasopharynx at the internal nares. There are 3 parts of the upper respiratory system: the pharynx. The nasopharynx is the superior portion of the pharynx lined by typical respiratory epithelium. It houses pharyngeal tonsils and auditory tubes. The oropharynx extends between the soft palate and the base of the tongue at the level of the hyoid bone. The posterior margin of the soft palate supports the dangling uvula and 2 pairs of muscular pharyngeal arches. On either side, a palatine tonsil lines between an anterior palatoglossal arch and a posterior palatopharyngeal arch. A curved line connects the palatoglossal arches, and uvula forms the boundaries of the fauces, the passageway between the oral cavity and the oral pharynx. The laryngopharynx includes the region of the pharynx lying between the hyoid bone and the entrance to the esophagus. The laryngopharynx is the most inferior part of the pharynx, and like the oropharynx, it is lined by a stratified squamous epithelium that can resist mechanism abrasion, chemical attack, and pathogenic invasion. The lower respiratory system, the larynx, inspired inhaled air leaves the pharynx by passing through a narrow opening known as the glottis. The larynx begins at the levels of vertebrae C4 or C5 and ends at the level of vertebra C7. It is essentially a cylinder whose cartilaginous walls are stabilized by ligaments or skeletal muscles or both. There are 3 cartilages of the larynx: the thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, and the epiglottis. The largest pharyngeal cartilage is the thyroid cartilage. It forms anterior and lateral walls of the larynx. The anterior surface of the cartilage bears a thick ridge of laryngeal prominence known as the Adam's apple. The inferior surface of the thyroid cartilage articulates with the cricoid cartilage. The superior surface has ligaments attachments to the epiglottis and smaller laryngeal cartilages. The cricoid cartilage is a complete ring whose posterior portion is greatly expanded, providing support in the absence of the thyroid cartilage. It protects the glottis and the entrance to the trachea. The superior surface of the cricoid cartilage articulates with the paired arytenoid cartilages. The shoehorn-shaped epiglottis projects superior to the glottis. The epiglottic cartilage supports ligaments attached to the anterior and superior borders of the thyroid cartilage and the hyoid bone. The larynx also contains 3 pairs of smaller cartilages: the arytenoid hyaline cartilages, craniculate hyaline cartilages, and cuneiform elastic cartilages. Laryngeal ligaments. A series of intrinsic ligaments binds all 9 cartilages together to form the larynx. Extrinsic ligaments attach the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone and cricoid cartilage to the trachea. The vestibular ligaments and vocal ligaments extend between the thyroid cartilage and the arytenoids. Vestibular folds, known as inelastic protection of glottis and vocal cords, or folds, are the true vocal cords. True vocal cords are different than vestibular false vocal cords. The larynx is associated with two different groups of muscles, the intrinsic and extrinsic laryngeal musculature. The intrinsic musculature has 2 major functions. It regulates tension in vocal cords and opens and closes the glottis. The extrinsic laryngeal musculature positions and stabilizes the larynx. The trachea is continued epithelium with respiratory tract. It's known as the windpipe. It's tough yet flexible as a tube with a diameter of approximately 2.5 centimeters and 11 centimeters long. The trachea branches to form left and right primary or main bronchi. The lining of the trachea consists of respiratory epithelium overlaying a layer of loose connective tissue called the lamina propria, which separates the respiratory epithelium from underlying cartilages. Mucosa or mucous membrane exits at the lamina propria. A thick layer of connective tissue, the submucosa, surrounds the mucosa, and superficial to the mucosa, the trachea contains 15 to 20 tracheal cartilages. Each tracheal cartilage is bound to neighboring cartilages by elastic annular ligaments, and an elastic ligament and a band of smooth muscle known as the trachealis connects the ends of each tracheal cartilage. The trachea branches within the mediastinum, giving rise to the right and left primary or main bronchi. The left and right primary bronchi are outside the lungs and are called extrapulmonary bronchi. An internal ridge called the carinales lies between the entrances to the 2 primary bronchi. Each primary bronchus travels to a groove along the medial surface of its lung before branching further. This groove is known as the hilum. It also provides access for entry to pulmonary vessels and nerves. The entire array is firmly anchored to a meshwork of dense connective tissue. This complex, known as the root of the lung, attaches it to the mediastinum and fixes the positions of the major nerves, vessels, and lymphatics. Lungs are found in the pleural cavity. Each lung is a blunt cone with a tip or apex pointing superiorly. The apex on each side extends into the base of the neck above the first ribs. The broad concave inferior portion or base of each lung rests on the superior surface of the diaphragm. Lobes of the lung has distinct lobes separated by deep fissures. The right lung has 3 lobes, superior, middle, and inferior, and the left lung has 2 lobes, superior and inferior, all separated by fissures. Lung surfaces. The left lung has 2 lobes. So the left lung has the left primary bronchus that leads to the superior lobar bronchus and inferior lobar bronchus. Secondary bronchi lead to tertiary bronchi. 3 tertiary bronchi supply the superior lobe, 2 supply the middle lobe, and 5 supply the inferior lobe. Each lobe of the lung can be divided into smaller units called bronchopulmonary segments. The bronchioles, 6,500 smaller terminal bronchioles made of smooth muscle tissue, supply the lungs. The sympathetic nervous system controls bronchodilation. The parasympathetic nervous system controls bronchoconstriction. Within the lobule, the terminal bronchioles branch to form several respiratory bronchioles. The epithelial cells of the respiratory bronchioles and smaller terminal bronchioles are cuboidal. Alveolar ducts and alveoli. Respiratory bronchioles are connected to individual alveoli and to multiple alveoli along regions called alveolar sacs. Common chambers connected in several individual alveoli. Each lung contains 150 million alveoli, giving it a spongy appearance. Lung surfaces. Inner contours of the ribcage are called the costal surfaces. The mediastinal surface is known as the medial surface, and the cardiac notch is found in the lung's concavity. The connective tissues of the root of each lung extends to substances or parenchyma. Fibrous partitions or trabeculae contain elastic fibers, smooth muscles, and lymphatic tissue. The terminal partitions or septa divide the lung into lobules. The pulmonary branch involves a bronchial tree spreading into the interpulmonary bronchi. Each primary bronchus divides to form the secondary bronchi, also known as lobar bronchi, to form the third or segmental bronchi. The right lung has 3 lobes, and the right primary bronchus divides into 3 secondary bronchi, superior, middle, and inferior lobar bronchuses. Each lobar branch delivers air to one of the lobes of the right lung. The left lung has 2 lobes, superior and inferior. So there is a superior and inferior lobar bronchus. Secondary bronchi in each lung divide to form tertiary bronchi. 3 supply the superior lobe, 2 supply the middle lobe, and 5 supply the inferior lobe. Each lobe of the lung can be divided into smaller units called bronchopulmonary segments. Alveolar epithelium consists of simple squamous epithelium. Pneumocyte type 1 cells are alveolar type 1 cells, which are fragile. Pneumatic cyte type 2 cells or alveolar type 2 cells are scattered among squamous cells to produce surfunctant coating each alveolus. Without surfunctant, the alveoli would collapse. Research has shown that smoking decreases surfunctant. The alveolar macrophages, dust cells, control the epithelium and phagocytize any particulate matter that has entered the respiratory defenses and reached the alveolar surfaces. Diffusion across the respiratory membrane proceeds rapidly because smaller distances and gases are lipid soluble. The membranes of the epithelium and endothelial cells thus do not pose a barrier to the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and alveolar spaces. Blood supply to the lungs. The respiratory exchange surfaces receive blood from arteries to the pulmonary circuit. The pulmonary arteries enter the lungs at the hilum and branch to the bronchi as they approach the lobules. Each lobule receives an arteriole and a venule, and a network of capillaries surrounds each alveolus directly beneath the respiratory membrane. Blood from the alveolar capillaries passes through the pulmonary venules into pulmonary veins that deliver it to the left atrium. The conducting portions of the respiratory tract receive blood from the external carotid arteries, known as the nasal passages and larynx. The thyroid cervical trunk branches of the subclavian arteries that supply the inferior larynx and trachea, and the bronchial arteries. The capillaries supply oxygen and nutrition to the conducting passageways of the lungs. The venous blood flows into the pulmonary veins bypassing the rest of the systemic circuit and diluting the oxygenated blood leaving the alveoli. Pleural cavities and pleural membranes. 2 pleural cavities are separated by the mediastinum. Each lung is lined by a serous membrane called the pleura. Parietal pleura covers the inner surface of the thoracic wall, and the viscera pleura covers the outer surface of the lungs. The space between the parietal and visceral pleura is called the pleural cavity. Pleural fluid covers lungs to reduce friction during breathing. Pulmonary ventilation or breathing refers to the physical movement of air into and out of the bronchial tree. The diaphragm, internal and external intercostal muscles, accessory respiratory muscles, sternocleidomastoid, serratus anterior, pectoralis minor, and scalene muscles. Hyperopnea is forced breathing. Abdominal muscles there are required. Euapnea is quiet breathing. Inspiration involves muscular contractions, but expiration is a passive process. Expansion of the lung stretches their elastic fibers. Diaphragmatic breathing, movement of the diaphragm, this is correct breathing, and costal breathing, movement of the rib cage, or shallow breathing. Pons and medulla oblongata regulate respiration in the brain. The respiratory centers are three pairs of loosely organized nuclei in the reticular formation of the pons and medulla oblongata. Apnoistic and pneumotaxic centers of the pons that are paired nuclei that adjust the output of the rhythmicity center to modify the pace of respiration. Respiration rhythmicity center sets the basic pace and depth of respiration, dorsal respiration group and ventral respiration group. Aging in the respiratory system. During aging, there's a loss of elasticity of the lungs, restriction in chest movement, so decreased breathing capacity, and 1 square foot of respiratory membrane is lost each year after the age of 30.